Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Christian, and I work in the fundraising team at VMPA. So basically, my role is to help make sure Jordan and our other lovely campaigners and staff can keep doing what they do best, which is standing up for nature. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all dialing in from today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm currently dialing in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Flemington, and would like to acknowledge that sovereignty over the lands of what is now known as Victoria was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners' tens of thousands of years of connection, care, knowledge, and respect for country, and that feral deer, like so many of the environmental threats that we face today, are a direct result of colonisation. So thank you for joining us tonight to hear about feral deer, the issues they cause, and how we can reverse some of the damage that they do. There's been an explosion of Victoria's feral deer population over the last few years, with an estimated 2 million now in the state. They've caused serious damage to our forests and wildlife, impacted agriculture, and are now a frequent sight on regional roads. Yet, feral deer is still protected as a game species under state nature laws. Here to talk about why change is needed is Dr. Alex Maisie and Jordan Crook. Alex is an ecologist who has spent a considerable amount of time in the Dandenong and Yarra Ranges, and through his time doing a PhD on lyrebirds and their role as ecosystem engineers, the damage that feral deer do to our forests has become increasingly clear to him. So welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
Jordan is VMPA's Parks and Nature campaigner and has spent the last 10 years in forests and on the ground campaigning for better protections for nature. With an academic and vocational background in conservation, land management, and arboriculture, Jordan has seen firsthand the consequences of feral deer being protected as a game species instead of known as the pests that they are. So welcome, Jordan.
Thank you.
Jordan, yep. And so Jordan and Alex will talk for most of the webinar, and we'll have time for a couple of questions afterwards. Please pop any questions in the Q&A during the talk. But yeah, over to you, Jordan.
Beautiful. I'll just get my presentation ready. Okay. Can you see that? Is that?
Yep, that's all good.
That's all good. All right, great. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. It's a beautiful evening out there, so we'll make it kind of quick so we can get out and enjoy the last of this beautiful weather. So my name's Jordan Crook, and I'm as Christian said, Parks and Nature campaigner at the Victorian National Parks Association, and have been for about the last 4 years. Very lucky to work at such a important organisation, and one of the only nature-based conservation groups in Victoria, taking on things like the listing of feral deer as wildlife. So the story of feral deer in Victoria and Australia starts around Koo-wee-rup Way. What was once the beautiful Koo-wee-rup swamp, alive with leadbeater's possum and helmeted honeyeaters, was drained, and then not long after, feral deer were released. This is known by quite a few people as the plague plague, which is very aptly termed. And this is where a lot of the issues that our rainforest and wildlife are having now from feral deer started here. So in Victoria, there's 6 species of feral deer. The 3 top ones are the 3 most common. The most common in my time in the bush is the sambar deer, who are also listed as a key threatening process under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. Red deer aren't that common out my way in the east, but are exploding in numbers in areas around Garryword, the Grampians. So as you can see from this this GIF that will run through a few times, the deer numbers and records, particularly around urban areas and coastal areas, and even out to the west where there's not much habitat left at all, deer numbers are exploding. And it hasn't gone unnoticed. So we all know someone who's seen a feral deer dodged a feral deer and even unfortunately hit a feral deer on the road. We all know folks who've got revegetation programs to try and bring back threatened species that are now having to fully fence them off to protect them from this protected feral species. But it's not just conservation values and revegetation programs and the like that are being heavily impacted. There's huge issues with transmission of diseases from feral deer across not just Victoria, but the whole of the country. So at the moment, there's only one disease that is spread around, so by feral deer. But there's quite a few that are kind of waiting in the background, and if they get into Australia, God forbid, those diseases will and can be spread by feral deer. So you can see this feral sambar. It's quite a large animal. It's the size of a small horse or a small cow, just jumping over a fence. So it doesn't matter if it's public or private land. These animals move across almost unimpeded. So easy way of spreading these pathogens and diseases into stock. So there's been quite a lot of study and work done and quite a lot of concern, particularly from the agriculture world, about the spreads of diseases by feral deer and also spreads into our wildlife as well. So Meat and Livestock Australia, those raging greenies and lefties at Meat and Livestock Australia, call them what they are, feral deer. And the first line there is one that really hits me, not just about causing significant environment and financial damage, but it really points out that feral deer are listed as feral. They are listed as a pest in WA, South Australia, the Northern Territory, our nation's capital, and Queensland. That leaves Victoria the only state on mainland Australia left to declare deer a pest, as well as Tasmania, not attached, both kind of living in this fantasy world of feral deer being a wildlife species, not a pest species. So the other impact that I see a hell of a lot living in a semi-regional area, as well as driving across the state, checking on our parks and reserves, and hopefully future new parks and reserves, is the impact of feral deer on the road. Now, I'm not a small bloke. I'm not a smallish bloke. 6'1" and 150 kilos. And that's me standing next to a big old feral sambar deer just out of Bunyip. So it's completely surrounded by farmland, and it had been hit, and the glass and plastic from the car that had hit it was also there. So the impact is growing. The impact is also growing closer to urban and suburban areas. And then we've got the ecological impact, which a lot of us here will see every day. We're seeing areas like this in the Dandenong Ranges turn from beautiful, cool temperate rainforest valleys into wallows, slurry, biodiversity crushed into this monoculture caused by feral deer. So it was about mid-2024 this year that the VMPA facilitated a letter to the Environment Minister as well as the Agriculture Minister about the need to get on with the vital work of listing feral deer as a pest. So remove them for the Wildlife Act and call them what they are, a feral pest. And this letter was signed by over 100 people in groups, so landholders who manage and care for Trust for Nature sites, farmers, plantation owner managers, local councils, all signed onto this letter because they're sick and tired and they're fed up with feral deer. It got quite a lot of media out there and kept this discussion going. I was interviewed on the ABC and all the calls in were talking about the damage that feral deer were doing to people's gardens, doing to their fences, and competing with stock for feed, as well as countless people talking about how their car got written off, or how they just don't drive at dusk and dawn anymore, where they live in areas like Flowerdale and Kinglake, because the risk of hitting one of these big animals, these big feral deer, is just too high and too risky. So, what is the Wildlife Act? So, the Wildlife Act is one of our pivotal pieces of legislation here in Victoria that protects wildlife. So, it's meant to protect critters like this greater glider, koalas, kangaroos, all those critters that have lived in this country for tens of thousands, if not millions of years, and have evolved from this land, not feral animals. It shouldn't protect feral foxes, it shouldn't protect feral cats, it should just protect our wildlife. But in a really weird, opaque way, feral deer are protected under this outdated piece of legislation that lists them, all kinds of deer, non-Indigenous, to be protected under the Wildlife Act, which is completely against not just the legislative intent of this act, but shows how silly it is that feral deer are protected for the purposes of hunting. And as you can see, you go on the Game Management Authority site there, and they also declare that all deer are protected as wildlife. So it's the VMPA's view, and most land managers, land carers, people who spend enough time in the bush on their own properties, on public land, across all land tenures, that it's time to call a spade a spade. It's time to call a feral, and to list feral deer alongside the other pests that are harming and killing our wildlife. Red fox, feral cats, they're all listed under this act. It's time to put feral deer there as well. So a lot of people, particularly shooters, say, why? What's the difference? It's going to stop this, it's going to stop that, but overall, it's not going to do much. It will do a lot. It will remove barriers to public and private land managers from just managing, reducing, and where possible, eradicating feral deer. Right now, those conversations can't even be had. The Wildlife Act should protect wildlife. It shouldn't protect exotic feral animals. That's not wildlife. They are not wildlife. This will encourage private landholders to control deer on their property and iron out all the bureaucracy or perceived bureaucracy around their listing as a protected game species. This will remove barriers to innovation, such as trapping or biocontrol, that are currently not being able to be looked into because of the listing. And one of the species, you still do require an authority to control wildlife, to control it on your private property as well as public land, which is a huge disappointment. So there's a lot that this change will do, and it will be a great step forward for Victoria and our wildlife and our wild places to list deer as what they are, call them what they are, call a spade, and list them as a pest. A lot of shooters, recreational shooters and the like, come and say, well, you know, if you didn't lock up the national parks, we'd be able to shoot in there. National parks are the most visited places in the state. Over 50 million people visit them every year. It's unsafe for people to be walking, riding their bikes, riding their horses around people trying to shoot deer. And it's a safety issue more than anything. People should be safe. And in national parks, in most national parks, they are safe from gunfire. There's a handful of national parks with remote areas that you can shoot deer, and that's all good. But when it comes to these areas, even the Australian Deer Association fully agree that you can't shoot in high populated areas in places of high use. It's just not appropriate and it's highly dangerous. So hopefully that quickly answers some of your questions. But for now, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Alex Maisie from La Trobe Uni so we can learn more about what Alex is seeing on the ground and the impact of feral deer on the Dandenong Ranges, as well as the iconic superb lyrebird. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Jordan. I'll just share my screen and put my PowerPoint into view. Okay, I think, is that coming through as a presentation, Jordan?
Got that bar thing there again.
Okay.
I think the 3 dots on the far right.
On the far right, is it?
Yeah, very appropriate.
I'm not sure if that changed it, but
Oh, now it's dropped to the bottom.
yeah, I think that might be a better spot. I can't quite get rid of that, sorry. And that's probably worse.
Yeah, nah, better down the bottom.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll have to make do.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience in the Dandenong Ranges over the last 25 years or so, since I was quite young. But I'd like to go back to the first colonists coming into the Dandenong Ranges. And now my slides aren't progressing. There we go. I've got a photograph here. This series of photographs were taken by A.J. and A.G. Campbell from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And you can see it's a very different time. Apart from the attire, the forest looked quite different too. This image shows a really big old mountain ash tree that's toppled. If you've got keen eyes, you might be able to spot the 2 men in that image. And if you're botanically minded, you might actually spot some slender tree ferns, which are an endangered species that still occurs in the Dandenong Ranges today. As progress was made, as was said in the day, this is an early telephone line being cut into the forest, and you can see that on the top of that huge tree, there's a man standing there. The forest was slowly being cleared, slowly at first, but of course this rapidly increased. This image is very telling of a different forest type where the tree ferns are out in the open. They didn't germinate there, but there was a forest that was cleared around them. And there are big gaps in between the trees. So it was really a very different environment to what we see today. And the trees were so big. So this gives a bit of scale to that tree, a fire-killed mountain ash with a horse in front of it. Really big old tree. And then finally, the view from Olinda, for those of you who know the Dandenong Ranges, by the 1920s, almost everything was virtually cleared, aside from little strips down gullies and very, very steep slopes. So if we look at a vegetation map, which is what we're looking at now, these colours represent different types of vegetation. And we're looking from around Eltham through Ferntree Gully in the middle there. And each of those colours represents a different vegetation community. And this is what the department thinks was present pre-1750. If we fast forward to today, and the white shows the cleared area, you can see for an animal or a plant that's living in that environment, it's a very different story. It's got to negotiate getting between little nodes of vegetation, which are our parks and reserves, and then finding those corridors between. So a very altered environment. So while that clearing was all going on, Jordan mentioned acclimatization societies going around collecting a range of animals from monkeys through to all sorts of things, porcupines, and a whole range of birds. And a lot of these birds and other animals were liberated, which meant they were let go into the wild in the hope that they would actually form a self-sustaining population. And of course, the sambar deer was one of those that did that very well. Now, I'd like to take you back to my childhood when I was about 10 years old. I was lucky enough to grow up on the edge of Sherbrooke Forest, and Monbolt Creek is a little creek that was just behind my place, and I would go down there. It was my backyard. And it looks like this, big old sassafras trees, the cool temperate rainforest tree. It was a beautiful, beautiful creek with rounded pebbles and stones covered in moss, crystal clear water that bubbled out of springs on the sides of the hill. And I would never hesitate to drink that water. I remember my neighbour saying it's the best water in Victoria. And every time I would flip over a little rock or a small log, it would be full of freshwater crayfish. Um, but more and more over the last 20 years, parts of the creek were looking like this. And this is the image Jordan had before, where parts of the creek were becoming wallows to deer. Um, and that beautiful, clear, fresh water became this sludgy, slow-moving, stagnant mud. Absolutely devastating to see over only a 20-year period. These are the sassafras in Monbolt Creek. Approximately 98% of the sassafras have rubbing by the deer's antlers. When the deer rub on the trees, they ring bark them. The fungus gets into the heartwood of the sassafras, and ultimately they're all snapping, falling over, and any regrowth is quickly eaten away by deer. And then large areas being trampled like this area here, devoid of vegetation. So that's what it looks like. We were noticing when I was a member of the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group from age 11, we were noticing more and more we'd see deer. And this image that was taken by Sally from the Lyrebird Group, there's a lyrebird nest on the right-hand side here. But this image just blew us away by the number of deer that were clearly in this forest. So this was monitoring. It was a motion sensing camera set off by the deer. It was meant to be looking for lyrebird activity, but it just shows the sheer number of deer in this very small park. And as Jordan mentioned, these are very large animals. They're eating a lot of vegetation, trampling a lot of very fragile soils. But just the number of deer in this short clip really blew us away. So it just keeps going. Pretty remarkable. But I'd just like to quickly talk now about what that means for fauna. So I've spoken about what it looks like, what the damage looks like, but now I want to talk to some research I conducted and published in Austral Ecology a few years ago. And I'd like to start with a map. So this is a vegetation map of Sherbrooke. The light green is the damp forest, so dominated by the stringy bark eucalypts, the messmates. The dark green is the mountain ash, which is the tallest flowering plant in the world, the big gums. And the pink there is the cool temperate rainforest. And you'll notice it's very linear, restricted just to creek lines, and it's quite rare in the forest. So not a lot of cool temperate rainforest. And bear in mind this map as I talk through some results on some lyrebird work that I did. But of course, the lyrebird shot to fame in David Attenborough's Life of Birds series for their complex courtship displays and their mimicry. This image is a male trying to attract a mate. And they're a very long-lived bird. They can live up to 30 years or more. And they have a very slow reproduction rate. So they only produce one chick per year. Importantly, they scratch in the soil. That's where they find their food for all the little invertebrates that live in the leaf litter. And this male has cleared a little mound in the forest to display and court his female or a female. And she's now assessing the tail, looking at the dance, making sure he can coordinate his dance moves with the song and deciding whether she wants to mate with him. And in this case, he's not good enough, so she's off. And she'll now go to the next male along the slope and see if he's any better. So the male lyrebirds have to work really hard to impress the females. When they do eventually go off and find a nest or find a mate that they like and build a nest, the females' work really starts. So in this little clip, I've put together a few shots of a female lyrebird who's been off foraging for food, collecting all those invertebrates in a little pouch below her bill. We call that a gular pouch, and you might see that as she comes up to the nest here. The nest is concealed in that vegetation on the side of the stream. And she comes up, pops her head in the nest, and feeds the chick. And you can see in this image, she gets a little curve in the tail, and that's because the tail doesn't fit in the nest with the body. So once she's fed the chick takes its meal and swallows that. It turns around and produces a little fecal sac. And that's a dropping that's coated in a really strong jelly substance. And she can take that sac, and in this case, she's right next to a stream. So she can drop the poo in the stream, and that keeps the nest nice and clean. So predators that use olfaction, or their noses, to find their prey will be less likely to find that nest. And then she drops that sack in the creek, and that floats away and keeps the nest nice and clean. So it's a busy life for a lyrebird, but of course nesting and reproduction is a really important part of any bird's life. So during the research that I'm talking about, I wanted to know where in the landscape lyrebirds lived, and particularly where they made their nests. So in this slide here, I looked at where nests were on a landscape scale, and the plot on the left there shows the probability of occurrence of a nest against the distance from a creek. And as we get further away from a creek, the probability of a nest decreases. So this is saying that lyrebirds prefer to nest closer to creeks, which makes a lot of sense. You saw that female dropping the fecal sac in the creek. It's a good place to nest. I also looked at the forest types that we measured, that I mentioned before, and I'll just try and move this little tab out of the way, so hopefully you can see the forest types there. But I've plotted here again the probability of occurrence of a nest against the three forest types: the damp forest, the rainforest, and the wet forest. And the one that has the highest probability of a nest occurring there is the rainforest. So they're really preferring these rainforest environments. And then if I can get my slide to progress, which it's not doing, sorry. And then finally, I wanted to look at some of the fine scale habitat features around nests, and I looked at litter depth here. So once again, I've got the probability of a nest against litter depth. And as you have deeper litter, you get to areas that are more suitable for nesting. So they need that litter to provide the resources for the chick to be fed properly. And if all of the forest is starting to look like this image on the right, obviously that litter layer is being destroyed, and with it, the invertebrate foods that the lyrebird relies on. So a big problem. And then I also looked at foraging, where lyrebirds were actually actively foraging across the forest. And once again, I've got the probability of occurrence of foraging against those forest types, and it shows that the rainforests were really important. That was where the lyrebirds were foraging the most. And I've popped that vegetation map up there again, so you can just be reminded of how restricted these areas are. And these are the very areas that the deer are impacting most. Beyond that, predation is also likely to be interactive with deer numbers. This is a fox taking a chick out of a nest, and likewise a cat. This is a lyrebird nest here. That's the female feeding the chick, but then shortly after, a feral cat has spotted that nest and gone in and taken the chick. It actually sneaks into the nest and devours the chick while the poor female's flipping in and out of the camera foreground, and then one whole hour later it exits the nest. But if the forest is opening up, then these nests that should be concealed by dense vegetation are going to become more obvious to those predators. But of course, it extends beyond just lyrebirds. This is one of those slender tree ferns, these rare ferns. These only grow in the cool temperate rainforest. This remarkable creature is Ostrogommarus australis, our rare freshwater shrimp. It's an amphipod. These guys live nowhere else on the planet. They're in the Dandenongs. That's why they're called the Dandenong amphipod, and they are highly sensitive to turbidity, or the sediment and the mud that's suspended in the water column in the creeks. They're detritivores. They break down vegetation, incredibly important. And of course, they're the food base for things like platypus, another animal that's in real decline in this area. But of course, if we're losing all of that fern cover, this is the primary habitat of other things like our small mammals, the native bush rat or swamp rat as well, and even the antechinus. So this is sometimes called a marsupial mouse, but it's actually more closely related to Tasmanian devil. And it's an amazing little animal that relies on that dense ground cover. If the ground cover's gone, so do they go, and this ripples up the food chain towards through the larger animals and the predators, such as these very charismatic large forest owls like the sooty and the powerful owl. So really big ecosystem-wide consequences. Back in prior to 2013, the local environment groups like the Friends of Sherbrooke Forest and the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group were getting quite concerned about the deer impacts. This is in this image, an image of Bill Incoll from Friends of Sherbrooke Forest that was published in The Age around this time. The groups lobbied politicians and agencies to do something about the deer program. And there was a program formed with accredited volunteer hunters to go and control deer in the park. It took an enormous effort from Parks Victoria staff to organise, and there was some early success, but unfortunately the success faded over time with fewer and fewer animals controlled. And really, the biggest issue was there was no monitoring undertaken with the program, so we couldn't really monitor the impact. Meanwhile, the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group did some exclusion fencing to protect sassafras in the park, and that was very successful. These fences are still there and protecting those trees from the rubbing antlers of deer. But of course, this is highly expensive and really just a band-aid, so it's not a long-term solution. But then fast forward to 2020, the Victorian Deer Control Strategy through some turbulent times finally came out. And this came with some funding through the state budget of 18.25 million over 4 years, and then a promise of 4.4 million per year ongoing. And this this Victorian deer control strategy set out some regional deer control plans. And I'll just briefly talk about the one that I've been sort of involved in, the peri-urban deer control plan, which was the first to be put together. And this was really positive because it was a state recognition of the problem. Funding was available for the first time to agencies for control actions. And another little side event that was quite useful and some progress was a governor and council order around deer on private land to allow private landowners with all deer except for, as Jordan alluded to, hog deer, to control deer, to be allowed to control deer without a game license or an authority to control wildlife. So that was some progress that we had. Before that, we were really in strife. Some of the local response in the Dandenong Ranges was fantastic. We've had a monitoring program established, and it's yet to sort of come to light how that's going. But before they started control, there was a monitoring program put in. High numbers of deer have been continually destroyed by contractors, and the community support is high around here for the many reasons that Jordan outlined earlier. Volunteers do continue, so sporting shooters that are accredited have made contact with a whole lot of private landowners in the area that are on large properties, and that does continue, and that's been a really positive way to allow landowners some way of controlling their deer or doing something about their own private problems. So that's been a really nice spin-off of that earlier program, which ultimately in the national park largely became less effective. So where to from here? Remove barriers to control. That's the clear thing. Wherever we can, we need to remove these barriers to control. They're archaic and they are problematic, and we need to move forward with it. A big part of deer being considered pests communicates the magnitude of the problem to the community. And we really need to ensure that funding continues. It's just too much to put this problem on volunteers. Like it's just not possible. It's not fair, and we know it's really not effective too. And then finally, funding to Parks Victoria over the past 20 years, as far as I've observed, under both Labor and Liberal state governments, just seems to be going backwards. So it's been quite sobering to see this sort of trend over time, and it really would be nice to see that change too. So we all vote. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Beautiful. Thanks heaps for that, Alex. That was really interesting. The being able to see the evidence and the images of the damage done by deer was really fascinating. So yeah, really interesting. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Sorry, in the Q&A feature. If you've got any questions for either Jordan or Alex, please pop them in the Q&A function, and we'll get through as many as we can. I've got a question for Jordan from Julie. So, what is holding back removing protection of deer as wildlife in Victoria?
Yeah, I guess like Alex just said, the magnitude of the impact of feral deer still isn't widely known. It's becoming more and more of an issue every year. But the main holdups is the conflict within the Environment Minister's portfolio. He's currently the Environment Minister, which he tends to forget about a lot, as well as the Minister for Outdoor Recreation. So there's a clear conflict there. And there's also a very small but loud lobby group associated with recreational shooting.
Thanks for that, Geordie. And so a question for Alex or Jordan, whoever. Realistically, what are the chances of having the listing of deer changed to, and if it is done, what impact will that have on deer control? So the deer here in the Grampians are often seen in herds of 50 or more.
You go, Alex.
I was going to say that's one for you, Jordan. I don't know how likely it is for us to see this happen. I mean, it's pretty clear to be common sense to me, but often common sense takes a while to prevail. But look, hopefully enough of the community can understand and are now feeling the impacts of deer. And I think there's a big communication piece in that. Like it's really important to communicate just the magnitude of the problem and to have it reflect accurately in our legislation, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess it's going to take more people who are affected, farmers, people who are hitting these animals on the road, conservationists, all continuing to work together to keep pushing and advocating for that listing as a feral animal. You go back 20 years ago, it wasn't even on the table, thanks to work by legends like Peter Jacobs and the late Phil Ingemels. It's there, it's on the table, and it's being discussed. So we just got to keep pushing, and the VMPA is not going to stop anytime soon.
Beautiful. Thanks for that Geordie. One more question for Alex. How can you confirm that it's all deer and not other pests? So this person says that wombats cause damage to land as well, and does not the reduction of wombat numbers balance any damage done by deer?
Yeah, we do have a lot of wombats as well. But in terms of the direct sort of effects of deer, it's clearly deer that are wallowing. Like nothing else makes the wallows. They're very clearly deer. Same as the trees that are being rubbed. So the rub trees, nothing else is rubbing the trees. Even the trails, I mean, the deer weighing so much, they're so much heavier than a wombat. They've got these hard hooves compared to our soft-footed native marsupials. It's a very different effect. And a lot of these animals are actually really important ecosystem engineers. And in fact, deer in their native habitat, they have evolved in a sort of tropical environment that's very high productivity. And they'd be causing disturbances that that environment would actually rely on. So in their wrong place, they just have these really detrimental effects. But those very same effects are crucial in their native distribution. So it's quite a fine sort of relationship between these different animals and plants, but particularly with the deer, it's very clear what's causing the problem. Um, and not so much me saying that, deer are causing the reduction in platypus or amphipods. There's a whole lot of factors, but deer are certainly, particularly for those aquatic invertebrates, they would be the key threatening process. And that's why they are listed as a key threatening process, particularly in the cool temperate and warm temperate rainforests.
Beautiful. Thanks for that one, Alex. A question for Jordan from Mark. So thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering what you are proposing as control of deer should be listed as feral that will improve on current control mechanisms like hunting. Given that your organization appears to support the significant expansion of national parks, which it might be safe to assume would significantly reduce current control techniques like hunting, how will these two objects coincide, increased national parks versus improved deer control?
Yeah, they're not exclusive, deer shooting and national parks. And there was a report from VIAC about the Central Highlands forests out there that said national parks declaration and hunting of feral deer are not exclusive. It's more a zoning issue in those parks and keeping other park visitors, safe. Shooting is dangerous, and we know the ramifications of that. We've unfortunately seen deaths out my way near Nuji lately, and quite a few others, people being mistaken for feral deer. So there's a need to, as Victoria grows, more and more people are going to want to visit these places. So it's all about zoning and keeping those shooters away from the general public and keeping them safe. In terms of national parks excluding hunters, it's a furphy and it's more of a zoning issue. What was the other question there, Christian?
So yeah, it was what were the other sort of control mechanisms that VMPA sort of advocates for?
Yeah, absolutely. We think all tools should be on the table, really. When you're dealing with a crisis like this, all tools should be on the table. So when we have issues with feral rabbits, we release viruses and the like. For foxes, we can trap them and shoot them and the like. So we want all that open. So there's techniques such as trapping and corralling of deer that isn't currently allowed to happen, which would be really useful in peri-urban areas where shooting is very dangerous, even when undertaken by professional shooters. And we know from the mountains and mountains of evidence that we can't just rely on recreational shooters alone to reduce deer numbers, because if that worked, we wouldn't have this issue. So we can't just rely on recreational shooters.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for that, Freddie. Thanks for clarifying that. We've got a question for Alex from Melissa. So I believe male roos also rub trees, such as stringy bark. How can one tell the difference between a roo rub and a deer rub, as I have both on my property?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know I'd be able to answer it very well because I'm not super familiar with roo rubs. We do have a very, very small population of eastern grey kangaroos here, but I've not seen the eucalypts being rubbed by anything. That's one of the shameful things about deer is they love to rub certain species, and whether it's cherry ballarts or sassafras or muttonwoods, they don't just randomly rub their antlers on any tree, and they certainly don't seem to like the eucalypts, which are a dime a dozen. And if we lost a few eucalypts to a deer rub, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But they're going particularly to these often usually rainforest trees that have smoother bark, possibly harder bark, and possibly even scented bark. I'm not sure exactly what it is that the deer like about those species, but it is species specific. And usually eucalypts aren't really, for sambar deer at least, aren't a species that they target. So the kangaroos aren't going to, I mean, the other thing is the deer antlers are very, very hard, and they're sharpening the antlers. They're also itching off the velvet when the antlers are regrowing, and they're incredibly strong. So the depth of the rub will be much, much greater with the deer than a kangaroo, which really won't be able to rub through the outer layer, the protective layer of bark, whereas the deer will get right through to the heartwood, and you'll see that that tree might even get completely ring barked, as in the sassafras here.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for clarifying that. So another question for Alex from Tim. So thank you, Alex. Very informative about the extended impacts of feral deer. Are you aware of the effectiveness of different control methods like contraception?
Yeah, so this is something that Jordan touched on, and there's been very little work done on alternative control methods. And it is a shame, and one of the reasons for trying to change the legislation in this way would be to open the door to those sorts of things. Again, it's just an impediment that doesn't need to be there to investigating alternatives. And obviously shooting, a lot of people don't like it. It's understandable that it is quite a confronting thing, but at some point we have to make a choice between these, saving these native animals, which are also going to suffer as a result of increased predation or habitat loss or destruction or degradation. And sometimes you do need to find a compromise. So, but all alternative methods should be investigated if we can. It's very difficult to do with the current legislation.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that. Jordan, we've got one for you from Ewan. Would you please ask people to report sightings on feral scan? It helps raise the profile of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone's got a fancy smartphone. So you can download the Feral Scan app, which we might put in with the email that everyone will get after this. And if Feral Scan's a bit weird and clunky on your phone, you can also use something called iNaturalist, which is a great app that records the point where you take the photo, and it really helps land managers understand what deer are in the area, the number, and also the species. Like we're seeing different deer popping up in areas, and it might be from someone dumping them, or they might naturally be moving through. So it's always good to try and understand where and why deer are moving through the landscape.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, using those apps and the sort of citizen science component is so important. Jordan, what will be the implication to landholders if they do get listed as a pest? As in, will the onus be on landholders to control them, as it would be a very expensive undertaking?
Yes, yeah. The onus will go on landholders. So just like blackberries and rabbits, foxes, under the legislation, where possible, the landholder should be managing those pests and invasive species. So, yeah, it would be out there, but it would also come with a level of support from the state to help manage those on your property.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for that, Jordan. So we've got 47 questions now in the chat. So I don't know if we're going to have time to get through all of them, but thank you so much for asking them all. We'll try and follow up with as many of them as possible in sort of a follow-up email later this week. A question from Clark. So what can we do to get the Act changed?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an action on the VMPA website that we put out around the time that letter got published with our 100 or so members and supporters. You can talk to your local state and federal MPs about the need to list deer as a feral species and what they're doing to your patch of the world. And keep collecting data like you and Ray's, so Feral Scan and iNaturalist. Keep recording where you see feral deer and their impacts, and the more data, the better understanding we have. So together we'll keep pushing, and hopefully in my lifetime we'll see them listed as a feral.
Yeah, beautiful. One for you, Alex, from Deborah. Can you identify the different species from their footprints?
No, I'm not able to be that good. I'm sure a lot of the deer hunters would know exactly which species they were looking at, but yeah, I'm really mostly familiar with just the sambar deer here. So yeah, they're all pretty big and and clearly deer. But I couldn't tell you if it were a sambar or a fallow deer. And I see here that Mark suggested that it's the turpentine bioflavonoids that they're after in the selective rubbing of trees. So there you go. Good to get that information too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jordan. If you have, what sort of baiting methods are used for deer, if you know, and is it species specific?
So there's no bait as such as like a poison for them, but you can bait them into areas by feeding them lucerne or oats or nice sweet molasses and the like, and congregate them in an area and train them to come to a point or an aggregation tool some people use. So it's more that level of baiting that we'd like to see more of, and more investigation into hormones or different, I don't know, what did you say, flaccolactoloids or something there, Alex, that might bring them in a bit closer and easier for people to shoot. So yeah, it's more about baiting them by bringing them to a point where it's easier to manage them.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, lots of questions for you, Jordan, and this is one that sort of if you have a response to it, that'd be great. So this is from Anon. So as somebody who's spent more time in the bush than most people, it's only when you zoom into fringe country that you can see damage by deer. We have millions and millions of hectares of bushland, and if you zoom out, the marks left by deer is no more than a needle in a haystack. I've never seen a dead tree that was caused by a deer rub. It's mostly cosmetic. Wombats most definitely cause more damage to the landscape than deer, and opening more areas for hunting is not as dangerous as was mentioned. Dirt bike riding poses way more of a risk to safety than hunting ever will. So in summary, zoom out and look at the big picture instead of taking pictures and conducting studies on a very focused area. Yeah, do you have any sort of comment or response to that?
Yeah, well, I guess the biggest thing you need in Victoria is context. And the context is that we are the most cleared state in Australia. So we've cleared more habitat than any other state. So 70% of native habitats and bushland is under concrete, bitumen, farmland. It's gone. It's not coming back. So those bits that we've got left, like Alex showed in those maps, we should be looking after. Just because you don't observe deer damage in your walks doesn't mean it's not heavily impacting an endemic crayfish in a creek somewhere, or knocking out rainforest in its westernmost extent. So deer damage, I've seen it. I go in the bush as well, and and all that. But deer are having a huge impact across all land tenures. I've stood in state forests that has smashed the cool temperate rainforests. I've stood in national parks that have been smashed, like what Alex has shown, all across the state. And I've stood on private land where people are trying to look after country properly, and that's being hammered by feral deer. So the context is we don't have much bush left in Victoria. The bush we have is amazing and unique, and most of it not found anywhere else on Earth than here in Victoria. So that bush that we have, we should be looking after. And best way to do that is to clear out the invasives and the ferals, and that includes deer.
Thanks for that, Geordie. And yeah, I reckon that's a pretty fantastic response to that, and yeah, a really nice way to round out the webinar. So yeah, thank you so much for Jordan and for Alex for your time tonight, and thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge about feral deer and the problems. Yeah, if either of you have anything you want to add, go for it. Otherwise, we might finish up.
Do you want to go, Alex?
No, look, I'm just thankful for people being interested and tuning in and keeping this topic alive. It's still a problem. It has been for a long time, and we need to keep at it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and I'll just say, yeah, thanks for all the questions. It's great to hear from everybody, and thanks everyone for coming. And we'll try and make some type of Q&A or something that we can try and answer a lot of those questions. So it's good to have those questions. So thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Jordan. And yeah, as I said, we'll follow up with some questions and answers and to some FAQs in the next couple of days or so. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much to all the VMPA members and supporters we've got out there. So yeah, leave it at that.
Thanks, everyone.